like AMSR or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to Nostalgia Talk.
Nostalgia, 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 nostalgia.
I think there's your opening. Okay. Welcome everyone. It's Cereal at Midnight. I'm talking to your man Heath, and I'm Lisa.
I think this is it.
Movies.
So yeah, we're talking about nostalgia, right? And so
yep.
we've been talking about this video for at least a year. It's been a long time because obviously we're living in this golden era of nostalgia where there's like 26 Transformers movies and like everything that's happening. And then you are a documentarian and a filmmaker, and you are like on the front lines of nostalgia. So I don't know, we talk sometimes about behind the scenes, like, well, what is this? We don't want to be a slave to nostalgia, but it's such a huge part of our lives. And so I don't know, where do we break into this conversation? Where's the first point that we want to make? Like, I guess nostalgia is a good thing, mostly, right? I should also acknowledge that somebody did, like, this video has been user it has been viewer requested multiple times. So this is from the people. So but no, nostalgia, right? So that's like, it's a good thing. It can be a bad thing. You got any, like, what's your take? Hey, what's your take on nostalgia?
What is my take on nostalgia? Well, I think you were right when you said before it's like a double-edged sword, because my thought has always been with nostalgia, like, I love it. I had a great childhood. I love going back to things that I grew up with up until the kind of, 8, 15, 16, when the realities of life kicked in. And I think that's where everyone goes back to, don't they? It's like the times when life was simple and we hadn't had heartbreak and we don't have to pay tax. And, we just had these great memories. Whether those memories, how you go and see a film and it's okay, and then the longer it's been, you just remember the good parts, and then suddenly it's like the greatest film in the world. Like, perhaps nostalgia is like that, where you're only remembering how good it was, whether that's a good or a bad thing. But there is the argument of, like, is there a danger of living in the past with that and not being present in every day and kind of yearning for that? Is it a yearning? Is it a celebration? I guess there's different layers of nostalgia. One thing that I think is really interesting is that we're kind of the first generation who's been able to really celebrate nostalgia. Yes, I'm sure every generation has their kind of harp back to better times. And then I think what's really interesting when you start getting filmmakers like with Grease set in the 50s, made in the 70s, and American Graffiti is, a harp back to George Lucas's childhood. And I don't think that generation had as many ways to share publicly that they were, they couldn't just go on eBay and buy something, and they couldn't make a TikTok video and go, remember this, cartoon, how great was the theme song? So I think we're just in a really interesting time that we're the first generation that can really celebrate publicly nostalgia, which is why I think we have this whole slew of 80s. In 10 years, we'll probably have 90s. In 20 years, I don't really know what they'll be celebrating. I feel like things just kind of died down in terms of a definitive culture after the 2000s. Yeah. But I wonder if it's an easy thing to go back to, like, isn't the latest Thor, I haven't seen Thor, but isn't that an 80s centric one? And you had Wonder Woman 80s and obviously Stranger Things. And I wonder if it's too much and too easy to like make it let's make it an 80s show. Let's make it, was it Fear Street, or I think the Netflix, there was a series which did like 70s, 80s, 90s. And I don't know, I worry that it's an easy thing to do, that we're going to end up with so many sequels and so many franchises, and everything's going to be 80s.
Well, yeah, and you look at, like, on one hand, it's really good, and you touched on so many things I want to address. So I'm gonna. That
was my brain dump.
No, but that was great, and you open up a lot of doors. So help me remember that I want to talk about the lack of new things. Everything is kind of an echo of what's already been. So I want to talk about that. But you brought up us being the first generation, and we were also, I don't know about you. I know. Okay, in America, we've talked about this before too. I don't remember if we were recording when we talked about it, but how, like, I was the first generation that was marketed to as a kid. That was one of the things that happened in the 1980s. Is they were like, the government here was like, it's okay to market to children. And so all of the cartoons that I loved as a kid were basically commercials for the toys. And then the actual commercials were more things. It was, the cereals that came with prizes and the toys, and everything was a product. And it was just like, we were just bombarded by this. And so at the same time, with all the things that you're talking about, we are also this generation that was specifically targeted as customers. And I think that that's why, I know so many people that have like GI Joe tattoos, and they have like the Decepticon logo, or they have Boba Fett tattooed on their leg or something like that. It's like, in one aspect, we never really stood a chance. Like, we were just fish in a barrel. And here we are now all these years later, and the stuff that I loved when I was 10, it's still in the movie theater, it's still on television. It doesn't always look exactly the same, but it's
But is
still
that
here.
also down to because people your age are now the ones making the movies and the head of the studios, and they're like, man, I love GI Joe when I was little.
Yeah.
Let's do another GI Joe movie, and then that's their way of probably
Mm-hmm.
celebrating their childhood. I love what you said, like the idea that people are getting like tattoos. I thought you'd never see like kind of an 80-year-old with like Scrabble or, the stick and the wheel tattooed, because they're like, it was the greatest time.
Yeah, well, you didn't see
It
that, right? Like, the 50s kids don't have tattoos of like toy robots. Maybe they do. Like, I
Yeah.
have seen toy robot tattoos, but not on people from the 50s, or like
Yeah.
model trains, like
Yeah.
it's not a thing. Model train, the
Yeah.
movie. Um, but so the other thing is, like, you were talking about, everything is something. So much of what we're seeing is things that it already exists. It's not new. And in the 80s, in this glorious age that we were, that we grew up in, um, everything that we're celebrating was new. And the things that you're making documentaries about, like, so Flight of the Navigator was not a remake. It wasn't based on a ride. It was a new idea. And Flash Gordon that was a serial, but it was, and you could argue that Star Wars was a huge influence on Flash Gordon, obviously. But like, these things that exist, the Never Ending Story too. Like, I mean, they weren't like an adaptation of a toy line or whatever, but like, now everything is, hey, you remember so and so? Like, it's this nostalgia obsessed society, to the point that I feel like, let me be careful how I say this. If we're not served with nostalgia, if we're not getting fan service for our nostalgia, people are furious. They're like, this does not make me feel like I'm 8 years old again. As if that's
Yeah.
the goal of some of this stuff, as if that's what we're supposed to be. Like, it's supposed to, and that's troubling. It's problematic, because at the same, like, it makes you feel great, but it's not creating anything new.
Yeah. But it's like we've almost, like, you think about, I mean, you're so good with film. Um, you think about, like, yes, you've had remakes and there are sequels, but you get to a certain point through film history. It's not like you have The Wizard of Oz 7. Like, everything was kind of its own thing up until the 90s, early 2000s, when like 6 versions of a film would come out, or you'd start getting these remakes so they don't lose the IP, or whatever the politics goes on behind the
Yeah.
scenes that we don't know about. But it just feels like really in the last like 15, 20 years, we've been getting the same movies and the sequels and the prequels and the universes, and they're really trying to just stretch what we already have instead of coming up with the new things. Like, if those movies in the 80s were made now, like, you would have Goonies 12 and then the spin-off TV series, and Chunks prequel spin-off about how he grew up. It would just, they would really milk it for all it's worth. And it's weird that it's really been only in the last like probably couple of decades that things have changed, maybe because it's this weird sweet spot that we're in because of how we grew up and how we were marketed to, and now we have this ability to look back on these simpler times and celebrate them and try and get them back again. But in 20 years, people aren't going to be looking back at their childhood going, what simple times we had. They grew up with their birth pictures on Facebook, and Like they were exposed to social media their whole life, so they didn't have this amazing, like, remember when we used to cycle and that was our way of, like, the street light coming on was how we knew to go home, and you could escape from school because no one could contact you. We didn't have mobile phones, we didn't. So it's this really kind of weird bubble of our generation where we have the means now to celebrate what we love about it, and we can connect with other people as well. Like anywhere in the world, we can just, like, forums and social media, we can message people and hear other people's memories. The generation before us couldn't do that, and the generation after us probably isn't going to celebrate their childhood as much as we do, because it's a really complicated world to grow up in, I think, now. Yeah. So I think almost nostalgia probably starts and ends with our generation in the form that we're in.
That's an interesting thought. That's really interesting.
That's not bad, is it?
That's not bad. Good night, everybody. We'll see. Yeah. No. Go out on a high note. No, that's interesting, because like in 20 years, I mean, you said it earlier, it's like, what is the nostalgia going to be for now? Because everything now is nostalgia for the past. Is it going to be this weird double layer of nostalgia? Like there's not. And with the music too, the music, like so much of the culture right now is being shaped by the culture of the 90s, the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah.
Because those were such unique, each decade had a unique feeling. And I don't know that that's true anymore. Maybe we're too close to it to see it. I don't know. But I
don't know. I mean, like, say, take Stranger Things. You have that show that completely captures the magic of 80s movies and 80s culture and growing up in the 80s. So then you're right, like this generation now, who in 20-30 years will be like, man, I love Stranger Things, but it's not going to be a reflection of their childhood and what they experienced. They're going to be thinking that's what I loved about, I wish I had been born in the 80s and I wish I grew up in the 80s. Like I don't know what there is now that is like a true kind of reflection of growing up now, that in 30 years they'll be like, yeah, man, I remember that's exactly what it was like growing up in the 2010s, 2020s. It's just, I know we've had similar conversations. It's like you look at a picture of the 50s and it's the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. There's all these like really defined fashions and music, and probably because we didn't have the internet, so we went on what we saw in magazines and TV, and we had 4 channels, like everyone saw the same thing. Yeah. And now there's just so much that it's kind of grown into a life of its own, and I don't know how you would celebrate today in 30 years apart from like us still going, the 80s were really great.
The 80s were really great. So there's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you specifically about this is because you make documentaries that celebrate these things, but you're also bringing this, life after Flash it is about Flash Gordon. It's also about the star of Flash Gordon and his struggles and his redemption. Same for Life After the Navigator. You're working on Life After Atreyu. I imagine there's going to be a redemption arc to that if I know you. There are so many documentaries that come out and they're like, boy, Gremlin sure is great. And then you cut to a talking head and they're like, don't feed him after midnight. And then cut to another talking head and they're like, you can't get him wet. And I'm like, I know these things. You're not telling me anything I don't know. It's this weird, like, it's a celebration of nostalgia that there's no journalism to it. It's just like, isn't it great? And I've never connected with that, but I love your stuff because you bring something new to the table. I'm just curious if this is something that you're choosing to do or if you're even aware of this.
I don't think I set out consciously to do that. Because also it's weird thinking back to kind of my last point about how you watch a movie and suddenly you forget all the bad bits and you just remember the good bits. And so is that the same as nostalgia? Like, it's been weird to kind of uncover beyond the good bits of how I remember these films. And it's I guess it's the equivalent of be careful, like meeting your heroes. It's like, be careful finding out too much about the films that you love in case the people aren't who you thought or the magic facade disappears. So I don't think I really was conscious of it, but it's definitely, I think the more you get into it, the more the documentary side comes into it, and the the filmmaker comes out, as opposed to just trying to relive childhood. Because if that was the case, it would just be all like bells and whistles, wouldn't it? And then it would be like, oh, don't film after dark or whatever. So I
It would
think,
just be a product, and that's not
yeah,
what
it would just be, yeah, otherwise like two guys with a beer at the bar going, wasn't that great, doing like Simpsons quotes or whatever might happen. So I don't think it wasn't a conscious thing, but you kind of forget that you're celebrating these iconic films, and you start to see the real people behind them, and then you just focus shaping the stories and telling the stories. But then in the edit, in the interview stage, that's one thing, but then in the edit you start to remember that you're celebrating this film. And then when you start putting music to it, and you have you start to build certain sections, then you can find the excitement and the nostalgic part of it again. Because you know that as a fan, I want to be able to watch it and still have that kind of, oh, I loved watching it on the cinema screen, or I really loved growing up with this film, and I remember how magical this film was to me. So I want to make sure that if people who watch the documentaries can still have that connection to the film. It's a really weird scenario to be in, because you have to kind of break it down and build it back up again and put it back together in a way that fans will love it, because that people are going to be watching the documentaries for that nostalgic hit. Kind of tell them the real story and then bring them back with a rousing ending of, oh, I wish it was 1986 again. It's definitely a strange one, but yeah, not something I was conscious of.
A thin line to walk, where you want to serve nostalgia, you want to indulge it and celebrate it, but you also don't want to be beholden to it and let that shape, let that replace unique thought and a new angle. And maybe that's the moral. Maybe that's where we're ending this, is like, nostalgia is awesome and it's impossible to avoid, and it just happens over time. The longer you live with something, the closer you get to it, and you build it up into this thing. My story, this too, like my story is like, I was not allowed to watch a lot of the shows that I wanted to watch when I was a kid, and that created this longing in me. And now, whether those shows are any good, whether He-Man or Ninja Turtles or any of these shows are any good objectively or not, it doesn't even matter, because they've become this pillar in my mind, right? I just love these things.
Yeah.
And that's what nostalgia does. It's this longing for the past. And it's a good thing most of the time, but we can't be slaves to it either. I think that's where I want to leave it.
One more, I know that you've just had this like brilliant ending. One more thought I had, just to kind of,
I'm losing you. What? Are you kidding me? What?
Was, I think, we've said that it's really difficult probably for kids now to, like, what is their culture now? What are they going to be looking back on? I think the danger comes into when our generation have our own kids and try and recreate the magic of our childhoods onto them. An example is, I know someone who has 80s cartoons taped on a VHS and puts them on for their kid so they can have the Saturday morning cartoon experience. And they get 80s style cereals and with little toys, and they're trying to instill the 80s experience onto them in a very meaningful, they mean well way. Yeah. But is that the negative, that then you're kind of ridding that child of their own Saturday morning experience? So I think that's probably a fine line.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good one to throw to the audience and let them weigh in on that. Guys, what do you think about this topic? And a lot of food for thought. Lisa, tell us what's going on with the whole life after. You got multiple projects in the works, websites, new things. Just pitch.
I joined TikTok, following CerealAtMidnite on TikTok, Life After Movies, and editing Life After Atreyu. We've got a few more interviews to do, but still editing out. And then obviously Life After Goodfellas, Life After Movies is the website, Life After Movies is Instagram. There's a few places, but hopefully a trailer or teaser will be out soon for Neverending Story. And rest in peace, Wolfgang, who passed away this week, sadly.
You just dated this video forever. No, just well, you got to come back and talk to us when things are a little closer to release date. Come back and talk to me again, or hey, maybe we can do another topic like this in the meantime. But I'll put links to everything you just said. I'll put links in the description of this video. Guys, go check out the TikTok. You're doing really well on TikTok, I gotta say.
I'm
Like,
really trying. It's quite hard, but I'm trying.
you're doing a good job with it. Okay, guys, continue the conversation in the comments below. Lisa, thank you so much. It's always a blast to talk to you.
You're welcome.
All right, guys. Till next time, we will catch you later.